Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here today. My name is Tyler, and as Matt said, I'm first year in seminary. This year, just graduated in May. And I almost didn't make it here this morning. I came for 8 o'clock to hear Parker preach then, and I nearly overslept. I woke up, my alarm clock had been going off for about 10 minutes, and I hadn't even noticed, because I was just so used to all the noise that in life in general, we're subjected to so much noise, and even sometimes do it to ourselves. That all this past week, I've been kept up by the sound of the construction on Main Street, and that's been amazing. But we do it to ourselves. We get mad at slow fast food lines. We are upset when the ATM's broken, so we don't have to wait till Monday to get money out. And if the internet takes longer than a few seconds to load, we get quite frustrated. In our culture, it's very fast, and we don't like silence. We don't like waiting, because waiting isn't productive. If you take too long to get something done, you've wasted so much time. We intentionally distract ourselves from life, from any time that we might think about the deeper parts of life. We use our smartphones whenever we get bored, and I had a roommate a while ago who would do homework while watching TV and having videos on the internet playing at the same time, just to keep the noise going. There's no such thing as an awkward silence anymore, because to us, every silence is awkward. And that's where we come to this passage today. There's a little bit of background on this story in Elijah's in between when he is at Mount Carmel with the showdown with the prophets of Baal, and here where he comes to Mount Horeb. He's told that Jezebel is seeking out to kill him. And so he's afraid and runs away and is then told to continue in the wilderness until he comes to Mount Horeb. He's been begging God to take his life because he can't take running for his life anymore. He feels as if he's failed, as if it's all over, and he's just as bad as his fathers before him, because in his eyes, the situation is no better than it has been before. Israel is just as unfaithful to God as they've always been. And so that brings us to this passage. Elijah settles down in this cave, and God asks him, "What are you doing here?" And interestingly enough, Elijah doesn't really answer his question. He just goes on and starts complaining about the situation, saying, "I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people have forsaken your covenant and thrown down your altars and killed your prophets, and I am the only one that's left, and they seek to take my life away." And so in keeping with the trajectory of the conversation, God doesn't answer Elijah's complaint either. Instead, he tells him to stand out on the mountain before the Lord. And then comes this wind that shatters the rocks, that shakes the mountain, but God isn't in the wind. And there comes an earthquake and a fire, but God isn't in those either. Instead, as the text says, there comes a low whisper, or the sound of sheer silence. Now, at this point, Elijah exits the cave. But we can't really blame Elijah if he would have expected God to appear in the wind or the earthquake or the fire, because these were all ways that God had done so before, is in these dynamic displays of power. When in the wandering in the wilderness of Moses, when God uses the earthquake as punishment, or even just before this moment that Elijah finds himself in, when God demonstrates his power over the false gods with a display of fire. But this brief silence is new. This hasn't happened before. Somehow Elijah still recognizes that the presence of God is here because he goes out at that time. But this wouldn't have been the way that Elijah would have expected. And sometimes we can get caught up in the same thing, and thinking that we're doing the right things and that God is turning up as expected in the ways that he always has before, and we don't often look out for the times that he's doing something new. And as I said before, we're a people that are tired of waiting. Without constant production, we're letting priceless time slip away. We do this in all areas of our lives, whether it's in family time, relationally, with our jobs. Is it possible that we do this in our spiritual lives as well? Because when I first came to know God, everything was new and amazing. Every day, the things that I'd taken for granted became suddenly turned around, given new life, and everything was just amazing. And after a while, this dynamism began to fade, and soon it felt as though God was silent altogether. And that kind of silence troubles us, that we're no longer feeling God, and we think we've done something wrong, or we're not following God correctly anymore, because surely God would talk to us then. But God is still present in the whisper and in the silence. Now see, after this moment, God asks Elijah again. And here I imagine myself in high school with my science teacher asking me, "Where's your homework at?" My answer being, "Well, I've been working so hard, I've been such a good student, and the homework's just way too hard," and whatnot. And then my teacher explains how she can take my grade down for this and how much it's going to affect me. And so in the same way that God asks the same question again, Elijah gives him the exact same answer, much in the same way as I would, having been given a chance to say, "You're right, I didn't do my homework. Is there any way I can make up for it?" And say, "No, the classes are still too hard and I just can't do it." Doesn't quite work that way. But it's interesting to hear God ask this question of him. Is why is God asking Elijah what he's doing here? First, I found it a little bit odd since God had sent an angel to tell Elijah to go in this general direction at least. But certainly God already knows what Elijah's doing there. But I think we can see by Elijah's response that Elijah doesn't know. And God knows that, and he's trying to get Elijah to realize this. And Elijah complains about his situation again. But then God, in keeping with the fashion of the conversation, tells him something a little bit unexpected. Rather than giving him an answer to the problems, rather than telling him that he has other people in waiting, he's not alone, or like he had with Moses in the book of Numbers, when Moses was in this same situation, in the same place. He's saying, "God, I can't take this anymore." And God provides for Moses the people and the spirit to be able to handle the situation that he's in. And maybe that's why Elijah had gone there, was to have the same kind of reaction from God, to be empowered, to be given a reaction. But instead, God tells him something different. He commands him to go and anoint 2 kings, one over Syria and one over Israel, and to anoint a new prophet in his place. What we see here is the beginning of Elijah's retirement, which is interesting as he's saying, "I can't take it anymore." And perhaps God is saying, "You're right, but this is bigger than you." And we can see in the way that Elijah responds that there seems to be some element of pride. That because he's seemingly failed, or because he's been threatened with death, that God's plan isn't going to work out. But he's actively disregarding what had happened when we talked about a few weeks ago with Obadiah, who said that he had hidden away 100 prophets in caves. There's at least 101 other people there, Elijah. I don't know what you're talking about. But maybe Maybe he's putting them aside because they've hidden for too long. They didn't stand up to be counted with the ranks of God, which would be ironic since here Elijah is hiding in a cave after 3 years of hiding in a ravine himself. I think here God is humbling Elijah. He's showing him that this story is bigger than him, that you're not the only actor in this play, that I have kings who are going to do my work, and I have other prophets who are going to do my work. And debatably, Elisha comes to become greater than Elijah himself. Because God is showing Elijah that Elijah is not the star of this show, that God is. That God doesn't need Elijah. In fact, he's showing him that very much by not giving him anything else to do. But God allows Elijah and the kings and the other prophets and us as well to be a part of what he's doing in the world, to be a part of his story. Now, something needed to come and break the cycle in Elijah's life. Something new to break him out of this pride. And we see that these miraculous shows of power weren't doing it for him. The wind, as powerful and strong as it was, didn't snap him out of it. The very earth shaking didn't, and the fire that had just happened before didn't instill in him this idea of God's power. He didn't react to the presence of God in those places. But what does is something unexpected, is that whisper in the silence. How often do we expect something big and loud to change our hearts? Some motivational speaker, or a new job or relationship, some bolt out of the blue to snap us out, or sometimes in the desperate times, do we wish for some tragedy to wake us up out of complacency? And yes, those things can do just those things, just like God had used the wind and the earthquake and the fire before. But God's showing Elijah here and us as well that those aren't the only ways that he can work. But why does he do it this way? Why does God speak in silence? Wouldn't it be easier if he shouted at us with a voice that we couldn't ignore? But I guess he does, though, doesn't he? Because in the whisper, in this intimate whisper, God bids Elijah to lean in closer. Is while he could, and we do as well, try to drown out the voice of God, God is begging us to come a little bit closer. And in a different way than showing signs of power and force that show how great, sovereign, powerful God is, God is showing an image of the Father, leaning in, and the whisper from his lips begging us to come a little bit closer. The silence forces us to kill our distractions, to take the things that we actively use to ignore God and ignore the problems in our lives. Because when God starts to say something that makes us uncomfortable, we'll bring up any number of things so we don't have to think about it. And this silence isn't a very popular idea today. As I said earlier, waiting doesn't seem to accomplish anything, so why waste the time? But discipline is an integral part of this bold faith of discipleship. And silence and solitude are a very special kind of discipline. So I challenge you to use the silence, and sometimes to even seek it out. Because in the midst of the silence, God forces down our pride. In the early centuries of the church, there were certain individuals who spent years and years in solitude, who are listening intently to God, who'd go into wild areas, live in caves as Elijah had been, and listen to the sound of God. And while it didn't seem to accomplish much in time, it seemed to be wasting their lives, it was those years in the solitude that God used to shape them into the people that he used to change the world. I don't want you to get the idea that I'm asking you to drop everything and go live in a cave for 5 years while you listen to God. But I do challenge you to spend some time in silence, putting away the distractions, to listen to the soft voice of the Father, to know that he's there and present in the silence, even when it sounds like he's not. Embrace the silence and enjoy it. Would you pray with me? Almighty God, we thank you for the gifts that you have given, for the great and powerful ones and the unexpected. God, that it doesn't seem like the silence, the solitude, the loneliness is some kind of gift, but you use it to shape us, to take away the things that hurt us, and to draw us closer to you. Lord, I pray that for everyone here today, in your church around the world, that you would make this more and more evident, that you would help us to use the silence and help us to listen to you.